It's time now for the news review of this bulletin. The Kremlin slams the European Union for planning to set up a special tribunal over alleged Russian war crimes in Ukraine.
As for the attempts to establish some kind of tribunal, they have no legitimacy, will not be accepted by us, and we will condemn them.
Peskov also said Russian investigators are working intensively to document what he called crimes committed by the, quote, Kiev regime. The Kremlin spokesman censured Western countries for a lack of, quote, decisive reaction to such investigations by Moscow. On Wednesday, the President of the European Commission proposed that the EU should establish a specialized court backed by the UN to investigate and prosecute what she called Russia's crime of aggression. France has publicly backed the proposal. Let's get more from Jerome Hughes, our correspondent, who joins us from Brussels, and Marcus Papadopoulos also joins us. He's an historian, political analyst, and author, who joins us from London. Okay, Jerome, first over to you. If we can find out exactly what it is that they're trying to set up here, and of course the Russian reaction towards this.
Well, Covey, I think if you speak to analysts, I say this smacks of desperation, that it shows that the eighth round of sanctions against Russia simply aren't having the desired effect. And so now you have Ursula von der Leyen and others in the EU. They're desperate to try and apply more pressure on Russia. And even you hear some of the own people in the 27 member states, some of the countries are saying, where can we find more measures to apply pressure on Russia with a ninth round of sanctions? And so this really does seem like that it smacks of desperation. I mean, of course, there are going to be atrocities on both sides in any sort of a conflict. We've seen that throughout history. You have individuals on the ground that do things, and that's certainly not to justify it. But the point is, I mean, look what was happening before things escalated in February. We had the conflict began in 2014, and you had awful atrocities being committed by Ukrainians against the Russian population in the eastern part of Ukraine. And of course, we've seen now, obviously this has been happening as well since February. It's going to happen. But, you know, I think a growing number of EU citizens are saying the EU is simply putting the cart before the horse here, and really talking about this type of thing when there's no mention of peace negotiations or trying to bring a resolution to this conflict, because we have a major crisis. I mean, if you talk about, they say that Ukraine is winning the war and so on. Well, I'm sorry to say, but if you look at the data here in the EU, Russia is winning the war because they're winning the energy crisis, they're winning the gas war. We have a situation where the cost of living is out of control. We have a major growing refugee crisis. I mean, you have 4.5 million Ukrainian refugees coming into the EU, and the EU simply cannot handle a refugee crisis like this because you already have major housing problems in many EU countries. If you look at France, if you look at Ireland, there are people, I mean, just the latest data, for example, come out in Ireland showing the latest homeless figures for Irish citizens. You have 11,500 Irish citizens, a tiny population of 5 million people, 11,500 in emergency accommodation, 3,500 of those are children. And at the same time, a growing number of Ukrainian refugees coming into the country. Where are they being housed? They're being put into hotels. So you have a situation whereby at the moment the accommodation providers are quite happy this time of year, but heading into the spring and the summer, there will be absolutely no tourism industry whatsoever, because there are a lot of people that rely on the tourism industry apart from hotels and so on, and yet that has just completely been decimated, and there's no end in sight until you have some sort of peace negotiations and to try and end this conflict. But instead, you have the United States and the EU sending $32 billion worth, 32 billion euro worth of weapons into Ukraine to keep the thing going. And now von der Leyen is talking about some sort of war crimes tribunal when all of this is happening, and no focus on trying to sort out this mess, which is growing by the day in the EU. It's really getting much worse. Inflation came down slightly in the Eurozone, but the cost of living actually keeps going up because interest rates are going up, so rents are going up, and mortgages are going up, and she's talking about war crime tribunals.
That's exactly the point that I'm going to ask you, Marcus Papadopoulos. You heard our correspondent there. This shouldn't be high on the list of all the different problems that the EU, the US, and maybe in some ways the world is experiencing.
Let me be unequivocally clear about something. each and every army throughout the history of warfare have committed war crimes. And that particularly applies to those NATO members who took part in the criminal and murderous bombing of Serbia, which involved, amongst others, the dropping of depleted uranium and cluster bombs on the Serbian population. Now, turning to Ukraine, should the European Union go ahead and establish a court to investigate alleged Russian war crimes in Ukraine, this court would be extremely controversial because its impartiality would be called into question. And why would that be so? Because the European Union is supporting the Ukrainian government, with vast amounts of European taxpayer money and vast amounts of military hardware, to the point where this is jeopardizing the stockpiles of certain armies in Europe, such as the French army and the German army. Furthermore, this European Union court would rely extensively on the accounts of Western mainstream journalists who are or who have been in Ukraine. Well, let me tell you this. Western mainstream journalists are firstly not war crimes investigators, and secondly, Western mainstream journalists have broken the most fundamental rule in journalism, namely, they have discarded impartiality and are openly supporting the Ukrainian government and are openly supporting the Ukrainian army. On top of that, I would like to see the United Nations Security Council establish a court to investigate all allegations of war crimes in Ukraine. And this court should be based in either Africa or in Latin America and staffed by either people in Latin America or Africa. And on top of that, I would like to see other courts established to investigate allegations of war crimes committed in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Syria, in Serbia, and also in Northern Ireland. And finally, the European Union, as your correspondent very well said just now, the European Union in private knows that it is losing the economic war against Russia. So the move by the European Union to establish a court to investigate war crimes in Ukraine is firstly as a sign of complete and utter desperation, and secondly, it is an attempt to up the ante in the media and information war against Russia.
Thank you very much for that. We appreciate it. Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, political analyst, and author. Jerome Hughes, thank you so much, a correspondent from Brussels. And with that, we come to an end for this edition of the News Review. Thanks for tuning in.